Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to be the latest in this long line of my colleagues from Maynooth who have come to Brockport here to share some of their research. What I want to talk about today is, in a sense, a new project, or I want to sketch out before you. I'm afraid you're sort of guinea pigs, and I apologize for that. But I want to sketch out the parameters of a project that I want to engage in and that I'm beginning to think about. But hopefully what I've put down makes sense on its own as a paper. So now from the fall of France in June of 1940 until December 1941, when the German armies were halted at the gates of Moscow and the United States of America entered the conflict, few people in Europe, in continental Europe especially, doubted that Germany would win World War II. Certainly in the summer of 1940 itself, many thought that Germany had already won the war, and that almost an inexplicable pride prevented its one remaining enemy, Great Britain, from accepting defeat. This conviction rested in part on the defeat of France, and certainly the nature of that defeat. It had been so overwhelming, so rapid, that it generated a belief in the invincibility of the German armed forces. But it rested as well on the excellent relations that, again, very surprisingly, Nazi Germany enjoyed with the Soviet Union. There was no threat to Germany from the East, and in fact the Soviet Union could furnish Germany with all of the raw materials and strategic materials that it needed, if necessary, to continue to wage war against the British Empire. So, even after December of 1941, it would take quite some time for Europeans to begin to accept the likelihood of a German defeat. It's only really late 1942 when Germany suffers three very serious hammer blows. The failure of the invasion of Egypt at El Alamein, when the British stop Rommel's tanks. The torch landings in North Africa, which was the first visible, tangible demonstration of American power arriving in the European theater of operations, and of course then catastrophe at Stalingrad that destroyed an entire German army. Now, after late 1942, there was still much to do, and there were new, if you will, depths of depravity to plumb thanks to the implementation of the final solution by the Nazis. Only then, by 1943, was Hitler's demise clear to most. But this still leaves us, I think, as scholars, with a period of at least a year and a half, possibly up to 2.5 years, in which Nazi Germany was on the ascendant, in which it was likely or probable or there was a chance that Germany would win the war, or would reach some kind of deal with the Allies and would remain master of the European continent. Within which people had to think about the future in this Nazi-dominated Europe. How would their countries survive? How would they have a meaningful role to play? Was something that would have to be negotiated with Berlin and with the Nazis. And really there was an incredible disparity of power, it seemed, between the remaining independent, neutral countries in the war and the Germans. Now, such a negotiation could only begin when Germany itself showed itself willing to treat, to negotiate, to speak to the neutrals and to its own minor allies about what the future held for Europe. But really, those who tried to understand this future of Europe were kept guessing by the cacophony that seemed to emerge from German authorities. It seemed that the really important Germans didn't have anything to say on the subject, and then there's a whole host of sort of secondary figures that painted completely different pictures of what the new order that Hitler spoke so much about would actually consist of. So like I said, what I want to do tonight is to begin to get my own ideas in order about this subject, and hopefully to listen to any suggestions that you might have, which will make my job much easier. So this is the first time that I speak on what I hope will constitute a new research project subordinated to this theme of coping with Hitler's new order, a project that will take in neutrals, occupied countries, and Germany's minor allies, that will consider the actions, the intentions, the hopes and the fears of governments, of business leaders and trade unions, of religious figures, of academics and intellectuals and artists. It's a project that will require a lot of thinking, even in terms of methodology and how best to deploy whatever resources I am able to amass in order to try to understand all of these different points of view about a time which I think all those who entertained such views would afterwards be very reticent about discussing. Nobody wanted to admit that they had actually believed and were certain about the German victory and what they had been willing to do and countenance during those years. So today what I want to do is focus on a couple of neutral governments, and due to pressures of time and space, really to restrict myself to two cases that I know best, those of Portugal and Ireland, two neutral countries during the war, which nevertheless present a very vivid contrast. And I want to sort of set out the two cases and to explore the differences between them. Now, as I said earlier, we should remember that this attempt to understand Germany and its intentions was being made by countries all over the world, even here in the United States, which, of course, held on to its neutrality until the end of 1941. We should remember, moreover, that the task facing the neutrals was made difficult or rendered almost impossible by Germany's own hesitations on the subject. Hitler's attention was ultimately focused, despite the good relations he entertained with Moscow at the time, on expansion to the east. And even here, in terms of what to do with the Soviet Union, when he finally went to war against the Soviet Union in 1941, there were all manner of plans from all kinds of different agencies, and that's how Nazi Germany worked. It was a supremely incompetent arrangement, the government of Nazi Germany in many ways. And there was this encouragement of competition among state authorities for Hitler's patronage. The war in the West had been in many ways an unforeseen accident as far as Hitler was concerned. He never expected that Britain and France would go to war to defend Poland. And so suddenly, before being able to turn eastwards to deal with the Soviet Union, he was forced to resolve the situation in the West. And so there had been very little planning about what to do with these countries that he would go on to defeat. So little or no thought had gone into what Western Europe should look like after the war. And indeed, some weeks before the invasion of France began, Hitler's propaganda supremo, Joseph Goebbels, told reporters, according to Mark Mazauer's book, Hitler's Empire, quote, "If anyone asks you how to conceive the new Europe, we have to reply, we don't know. Of course, we have some ideas about it. But if we were to put them into words, it would immediately create more enemies for us. Today we talk about Lebensraum. Well, anybody can interpret it as they wish. When the time comes, we will know them very well. We will know very well what we want." So whatever Hitler's thoughts on this matter, if indeed he had any, plans and position papers began to emerge from below, from the German civil service, from German academia, from other centers over the course of the summer of 1940. And they transport us back in time to the First World War and to the many lists of war aims that were amassed and published by German authorities during that conflict, beginning with the famous or infamous September program of 1914, which was arrived at by Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. In 1940, emphasis was placed on economic issues. And the prevailing thought emanating from Berlin seemed to be that since the end of World War I, Europe had seen far too many barriers to international commerce being erected within its borders, restricting the growth of the European economy. And this was a situation that disproportionately hurt Germany with its massive industrial capacity. So it was now said in 1940 that a more rational approach was necessary in order to promote growth and rid the continent of the scourge of unemployment, which had been present ever since the Great Depression. This was to be no simple free trade area, since the state, the German state, would be enforcing the rationalization of production, creating cartels, and assigning each European country its own set of economic tasks. There was eventually talk of a common external tariff and even a common currency for Europe, all under German tutelage. And European self-sufficiency was, as far as possible, one goal, and African colonies of the European countries would provide raw materials and a captive market. After some hesitation, the task of planning Europe's future was eventually handed to Hermann Göring, who was obviously, as everybody knows, the head of the German Air Force, but he was also the head of the economic four-year plan, and the economics minister, Walter Funk. Funk's officials, part of a civil service which had been inherited from the Weimar Republic and even the Wilhelmine Empire before it, drew on the experience of World War I, and were in fact happy to consult with European business leaders about some kind, and the term was already used, of European Union, where economic interest groups would have a direct say and access to power. The Swiss newspaper, the Journal de Genève, on the 27th of June 1940, reported on these efforts, and Switzerland is as a neutral, is very important because of its linguistic complexities, but also because its press was relatively freer than those of other neutral countries. In any case, it reported on these efforts, attributing them to a man called Schacht, who had been the economic minister of Germany from 1934-37, and who, the newspaper said, had been charged by Hitler personally with the drawing up of a plan for a new European economic order. According to this newspaper, the plan as it existed noted the complementary nature of the industrialized west of Europe and the rural southeast, essentially the Balkans. And its aim was to, quote, suppress the waste and the crisis of overproduction, which resulted from competition inherent in a market economy, and replacing it by centralizing European economic organization. But this was just speculation that was being reported by the Swiss newspaper. Speculation made possible by the fact that the real power brokers in Nazi Germany had their eyes elsewhere. In the medium-term future, the inability to deliver a knockout blow against Great Britain complicated the task of reshaping Europe along Nazi economic and political criteria, as did, when it finally began in June of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. From that moment on, talk of cooperation and integration of the European economy began to falter, and in fact lost all credibility, because more and more the Nazis relied on Europe, and especially Western Europe, to supply their war machine. So they just seized resources, they seized wealth, and they seized human beings and used them to strengthen Germany's productive capability. By 1942, Germany was involved in an industrial war against the whole of the British Empire, the USSR, and the United States. And talk of new order and restructuring of Europe simply came to an end. More than the underdeveloped East, it was the wealthy countries of Western Europe whose resources proved most valuable to Germany's war effort. And exploitation, not reform, became the name of the game, while simultaneously the final solution began to be implemented. So whatever mask of cooperation and progress the Third Reich had still managed to wear at that point disappeared completely. And until 1944, the neutrals simply tried to survive unscathed, if possible, the death throes of Nazi Germany. As the war raged across Europe, the number of neutrals fell, Germany showed very little concern for the rights of small nations and neutrals in general. By 1941, there were very few left. Ireland, Portugal and Spain, Sweden and Switzerland, and Turkey. There was almost no territorial continuity between these countries, apart from Spain and Portugal, and their political creeds, as well as the nature of their relationship with Germany, varied greatly. Some were parliamentary democracies, others were conservative dictatorships. There was very little chance that they could ever come together to defend the status and prerogatives of neutral countries, which were very much under attack by the Allies as well as the Axis, or even each other's right to exist in the face of Nazi aggression. It was really every neutral country out to defend its own interests and out to protect them and the others be damned. Some, notably Spain, were tempted by the thought of entering the conflict on the Axis side, although it never did in the end. Neutrals' attitude in the war to come was to depend to a large extent on their proximity to the belligerents, and especially to Germany itself. The further away you were, the more independent a stance you could assume. So, for example, Mark Mazauer writes in relation to Switzerland that the shooting down in 1940 of German planes by the Swiss Air Force and the discovery by Germany that there had been Swiss-French defense arrangements in place and talks had enraged Germany towards Switzerland and had cowed Swiss politicians who were swift to placate this German anger. And Mazauer writes, but in fact, the Germans were again rather restrained in their demands. They did not insist on the Swiss passing new racial laws or measures that might have challenged Switzerland's policy of neutrality. They knew that France was watching how they treated the Swiss, and they wanted above all to bring Vichy fully onto the Axis side. Military invasion plans were shelved too, because they did not want a row with the Italians over how to divide up the country. And something that Mazauer doesn't mention there, but which obviously was important to Nazi Germany as well, was the availability of the Swiss banking system. You know, Nazi Germany was a supremely corrupt state, and people were amassing huge fortunes. And even in Nazi Germany, they needed to have somewhere to stash that money away, and the Swiss banking system was a good place for that. Now, I want to focus, as I said today, on two specific neutrals, Ireland and Portugal. These were united by certain traits: a still agrarian economy, a heavily nationalist outlook, and primacy of place afforded the Catholic Church. But these were very different regimes, and they enjoyed a very different relationship with Great Britain. For Portugal, Britain was its oldest ally, an alliance that stretches back to the 14th century. Britain was the ultimate guarantor of the safety and integrity of European Portugal and its rather fragile, if large, colonial empire. For Ireland, of course, Britain was a begrudging occupier which insisted on holding on to Northern Ireland, or the Six Counties, through what Dublin referred to as partition. A British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, leading to national reconciliation, was Dublin's overriding diplomatic priority. And to that end, it was really willing to sacrifice rather a lot. For Portugal, priority lay in being left alone to develop its resources and its colonial empire. Now, Portugal had since 1926 been a dictatorship, first under military control, and then from 1932 onwards under the leadership of this man, António de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar would govern Portugal uninterruptedly until 1968. So he had a very good, as they would say in Britain, innings in power. He was in power for about 40 years. Salazar saw World War II as a tragedy for Europe, a further self-inflicted blow, a self-inflicted wound coming so shortly after World War I, from which he believed Europe had yet to recover. At stake, he believed, was Europe's dominant position in world affairs and even its ability to resist the spread of communism. From the beginning of the war, though, and this is, I think, is quite remarkable, Salazar attempted to understand the implications for Portugal of a possible German victory, which he believed had come already in the summer of 1940, when France bowed out of the conflict. Salazar, as a professor, enlisted the help of former university colleagues from the University of Coimbra to help him in this task, asking them to pool whatever information they came across about Germany's intentions and to help him decode the messages that were emanating from Berlin. He read with great care the reports coming from the Portuguese embassy to the German capital, and as I said earlier, most of the details that were emerging in 1940 seemed to fall into the economic category and were cause for concern. The German economic minister, Walter Funk, had spoken in August of 1940 at a trade fair in the city of Königsberg on the need for the political consolidation of Europe, which he said was the sole means to bring about the, quote, intensification of the whole economic life of the European vital space. So you needed a kind of a central political authority in order to solve Europe's economic difficulties. Some days later, at another trade fair, now in Vienna, Funk returned to the same theme, and he stated that, quote, Germany's economic policy has as its objective ending the economic atomization of Europe, considering as insane the excessive autarky by which every small country desires to manufacture everything from a button to a heavy railroad engine. Such excessive autarky was to be replaced by a, quote, reasonable and healthy division of labor to be overseen by Germany. Also worrying were Italian prognoses about the future of Europe, such as that advanced by Exchange Minister Raffaello Riccardi in Mussolini's own newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia in October of 1940. Riccardi described an extension across the continent of the solidarity which he claimed already existed within the Axis powers, and called for the creation of an economic hierarchy among the nations, which would determine access to raw materials. And for this purpose, in fact, the colonial empires would be revisited and the lands and resources redistributed. Now, this was Portugal's own nightmare. For decades, it had worried that, given its own backwardness, essentially, that its colonies would be taken away by the greater powers, notably Angola and Mozambique. Another Italian figure whose writings were studied was a Venetian financier and minister, Count Volpi de Misurata, who was very active in this period. Their combined writings and speeches led one of Salazar's collaborators, a man called Diogo de Almeida, to exclaim in a letter to Salazar, "How shameless these gentlemen are! Theirs is not an axis, it's a skewer with which to roast the agricultural countries of Europe once the war is over." And he had a point. On the 16th of July 1940, again the Journal de Genève in Switzerland published the translation of an article by a German journalist, Karl Megerle, which had been published in the leading German financial newspaper, the Berliner Börsen-Zeitung. Arguing that a divided Europe would, in the long run, lose its place in the world, Megerle warned that neutral states would be required to undergo a profound revolution in their outlook and action, being asked to abandon, quote, all opportunism, all exaggerated nationalism, and accept the principle that to entrust oneself to the protection of a great empire is compatible with the honor of a small state. The lengthiest and most important piece of Portuguese research on the nature of the proposed new order was carried out by a diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a man called Tomás Wiley Fernandes. Wiley Fernandes pored over the speeches and statements made by German and Italian officials before coming to his pessimistic conclusion, which he delivered to Salazar. He wrote, in its political aspect, the foreseeable future for small nations within the new order is that of a de facto diminution of their independence, even if de jure they are not on the surface affected. Throughout 1941, there continued to be monthly assessments by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Lisbon of the economy of occupied Europe. Reporting on the creation of an organization designed to regulate and operate a Europe-wide coal trade, one Portuguese diplomat stated that a move was being made from wartime improvisation to the actual laying down of a new European order. Other signs were the creation of an insurance syndicate designed to replace Lloyd's of London, and the operation of a central clearing in Berlin to regulate the trade between neutral states such as Switzerland and occupied countries such as Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. In other words, all of the wealth, all of the great deals would be done via Berlin, which would become the economic and the financial heart of Europe. Salazar's collaborators, when they got new information, would rush to inform him of what they had learned. Augusto de Castro, a journalist and sometime diplomat, met Baron Werner von Rheinbaben, a German diplomat and member of parliament, in Lisbon in May of 1941. Von Rheinbaben had just arrived from Paris, where he had delivered a lecture on the subject of the New Europe to collaborationist French circles. And he assured his Portuguese interlocutor that Salazar had nothing to fear from Hitler, who understood well Portugal's position in the war and admired the order and organization to be found in Portugal, which contrasted sharply, he said, with the confusion that reigned in Spain, of which the Germans were now despairing. Rheinbaben went on to state that Hitler, given his, quote, realistic temperament, had not yet made up his mind about the new order. But he reassured Castro that there was no plan to force the whole continent into a rigid Germanic formula. And Castro sort of summed up his words. Germany knows that Europe's strength and character lie in its plurality. There is no question of eliminating it. Rather, it will be the case of steering it towards a modality of common economic and social defense to make Europe European. Augusto Castro sent some of the extracts from von Rheinbaben's lecture in Paris to Salazar, who carefully underlined passages about the need to create a common economic organization in Europe, and about the subordination to this organization of the African continent. We can therefore have a clearer picture about what was going on in Salazar's mind when he met the German ambassador, Hühne, that same month. According to the latter, in his report to Berlin, a very serene Salazar had proclaimed his sympathy for the new European order. Its beginning was unmistakable, and to ignore it as Britain does, Salazar said, was incomprehensible. Ignoring it was one thing. Thinking through its implications was quite another. And whatever his honeyed words to the German envoy, it is clear that by September of 1941, Salazar was under no illusion about the real nature of the new order. He wrote to one of his most trusted confidants, this Swiss intellectual, the Count Gonzague de Reynaud, in May of 1941, quote, ignoring the fact, beyond economic organization or reordering of Europe, there are other factors of equal or higher value: independence, national personality, culture, freedom, religion, and restricting ourselves to the economic camp. I am very much afraid that this new Europe is simply the organized exploitation of the agricultural countries by the super-industrialized countries, in this case, principally Germany. A new entity had to be created in order to prevent this catastrophic scenario from being played out. Salazar believes that only a Latin Union, bringing together France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and the countries of Latin America behind them, might be capable of standing up, by whatever means necessary, to the emerging German colossus. Salazar added, quote, I considered a calamity for Europe that Nazism should impose itself everywhere with its virulence and the rigidity of some of its principles. For those of us who see civilization from a moral point of view, it will be a step backwards. And meeting the German ambassador again in March of 1942, Salazar complained of the lack of information about the future with which everybody was having to cope. Extreme opinions could be heard, he said, according to which the Germanization of Europe was underway. Unless Germany revealed its plans and contradicted these calls, suspicion would continue to mount. And in his own account of the meeting with the German diplomat, Salazar wrote, quote, "The loss of political independence, ignorance about each country's culture, and the fusion of European nations in a political creation of which Berlin would be the center, would lead Europe to lose its character and its extra-European influence, and maybe even its civilizing potential." But despite this plea for information, there was no word that ever arrived from Berlin about what the new order would indeed look like. Now, Portugal would go on to preserve its neutrality and, for the most part, its territorial integrity during the war. Salazar's greatest fear was to see Spain enter the war on the side of the Nazis, because this would drag the whole Iberian Peninsula into the war, including Portugal. And to prevent this, Salazar worked very closely with British diplomats in Spain to convince General Franco of the absurdity of leading his war-torn country after the Spanish Civil War into this much greater conflict. Portugal would later make bases available to first the British and the Americans in the Azores Islands to continue to wage war against German U-boats. By this stage, late 1943, 1944, there was no longer any doubt about the eventual outcome of the war, or even the true nature of the Nazi regime. There being thus no need to worry about how to live alongside it. Ireland presents a very interesting case and a point of comparison, and it shows how this project that I'm beginning to think about is actually so very complex, because every country has to be examined in great detail, and their attitude to something as basic and immediate as this is very different indeed. Ireland's political life was dominated by another larger-than-life figure, in this case Eamon de Valera, who was the Taoiseach, or Irish Prime Minister, and Minister for Foreign Affairs, like Salazar was in Portugal. Ireland would also survive the war largely unscathed, and its neutrality, like Portugal's on the whole, was tilted towards the Allies. However, as we shall see, its priorities were very different to those of the Portuguese when it came to how to survive during the war and how to ascertain Europe's future. I think Ireland was much more inward-looking and devoured by its own political questions than Portugal was. Portugal, because of its empire, had to consider what was happening across the whole of the European continent, what was happening in Africa, what was happening in Asia. Ireland worried about itself, to such an extent that the Irish didn't talk about World War II. For a long time afterwards, they talked about the emergency. So it's like this global conflict was a really tough time for Ireland. It was a terrible thing that happened to Ireland, and it was the emergency. And sort of what happened outside its borders was of less concern. So great was the impression made by Germany's armed might in 1940, and by its technological proficiency, that even in Ireland, far removed as it was from the continent, a German invasion was feared, and this would be a German invasion to be carried out with the help of a prescribed organization, the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army. Late in May 1940, and throughout the ensuing summer, negotiations were held in Dublin and in London between Irish and British officials regarding the provision of British military aid in case of a German invasion. And Ireland's foremost diplomatic historian, Dermot Keogh, writes that this represented, quote, an unprecedented level of cooperation between the two countries. This did not mean, however, that Ireland was ready to abandon its neutrality, even after that status had failed to protect so many nations on the continent. As a result, there was a constant need to explain the rationale for Irish neutrality, something which the Portuguese didn't have to do. The British wanted the Portuguese to stay neutral and help keep Spain out of the war. But they wanted Ireland to enter the war on their side. And before British opinion, before the opinion of the British dominions like Canada and Australia, and before the opinion even here in the still neutral United States, the Irish again and again had to explain why it was that they were neutral. And as the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, a man called Joseph P. Walsh, who was really Ireland's leading diplomat, wrote on the 26th of February 1940 to Ireland's ambassador to Canada, "Neutrality is the natural and only attitude for Ireland with her history of persecution and economic impoverishment, the loss of half her population through laissez-faire policy, etc. To go into the war would mean civil war, and that is the universal view here. To go to war alongside Britain when Britain still held part of Ireland was seen as something that would spark off domestic or civil war." He continued, "No need to apologize for our neutrality. The countries at war are fighting for their own immediate material interests. Spiritual evils cannot be cured by the supreme evil of war. All of this will be admitted when the war is over, as it was after the last war. And Canada, as well as other countries, will admit that the Irish government was right." So this is the message being sent out to the ambassador in Canada. Now, as I said, the British and later the Americans very much wanted Ireland's support, fearing first that the country might be used as a backdoor for an invasion of Britain, and then in order to base anti-submarine forces on Irish soil. And resisting such approaches became the full-time occupation of Irish diplomacy, not thinking about what the future would hold, not what a German-dominated Europe would look like, just the immediate task of explaining and defending Irish neutrality. Walsh had placed great hopes on Italy remaining aloof from the war, and continued that Italy would continue its 1930s role of a mediator between Hitler and the Western democracies. But it was not to be, of course. Italy went to war in the summer of 1940 when it looked that France was already defeated. Still, Walsh was convinced that by the summer of 1940, the war had come to a practical end. He wrote in a memorandum dated the 21st of June 1940 that, quote, "Britain's defeat has been placed beyond all doubt." And he continued, "The entire coastline of Europe, from the Arctic to the Pyrenees, is in the hands of the strongest power in the world, which can call upon the industry and resources of all Europe and Asia in an unbroken geographical continuity as far as the Pacific Ocean, thanks to the Soviet Union. Neither time nor gold can beat Germany. It is frankly acknowledged in America that America must look to her own defenses." One by one, European countries were moving away from the British orbit into Germany's. Even South Africa, Walsh explained, was on the brink of civil war because many wanted to cut the existing links with Great Britain. In another gloomy memorandum on the 1st of July, Walsh wrote, "It does not seem that there is a single organized state left in Europe or Asia which is not ready to profit by what they regard as the impending downfall of Britain." And he elaborated on this prognosis on the 11th of that month. He wrote, "The moment Germany and Russia, even without Italy or Japan, proposed to act together against England, her fate was sealed." So he interpreted the Russo-German Pact of 1939 as an alliance against England. To the sane looker-on, Chamberlain's announcement of England's declaration of war on Germany in his radio talk of 3rd September 1939 sounded the death knell of the British Empire. Britain has suffered the greatest defeat in her military history in the Battle of Flanders. Driven out of Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France, she is a relatively small, densely populated industrial island beleaguered by an air force which is at least 5 times as strong in numbers as her. You almost get a sense that Walsh is reveling in this, that finally the British are going to get what's been coming to them for a long time. Not everybody, however, shared Walsh's view. On the 17th of June 1940, the very day of France's surrender, Michael Rinn, then a legal advisor at the Irish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, set out his prospects for the future course of events. No invasion of Britain, he said, would be immediately attempted by the Germans. There would, however, in all probability, take place a blockade of Britain, which would involve the North Sea and the Western Atlantic as far as the west of Ireland. There would also be an aerial assault of Britain, about which he was right. After some time, an invasion might become possible, or maybe even just a threat invasion would force Churchill's resignation. But the contest, he said, was very far from decided. That being the case, Ireland did not actually have to worry about an invasion, but it nevertheless had enough on its plate: the movement of Irish shipping, the continuance of essential imports, the absorption by the Irish economy of products which could no longer be exported, the internment of troops who entered Irish territory, the possible accommodation of refugees from Northern Ireland should the fighting extend there. So there are plenty, he said, to worry about, but not an invasion. That's not really likely. There was, in other words, and unlike, I think, in Portugal, a plurality of views within Irish diplomatic circles about the course of events to come. Invasion fears lasted until the end of July 1940. Late that month, formal assurances were received from Germany that no invasion of Ireland had even ever been contemplated or was contemplated in the future, and something which the British would not provide, much to Dublin's great irritation. But this did not mean that diplomatic pressures on Dublin ceased. Britain, Australia, Canada, and the still neutral United States exerted enormous pressure on the Irish to join in the struggle against Hitler. If nothing else, by returning the so-called treaty ports, which had been ports that Britain had held on to when Ireland had become independent, but which had been returned to Ireland as part of a larger diplomatic deal in 1938. Churchill wanted them back, and the Irish would not grant them. Dublin refused to return those ports, digging its heels into the ground and explaining that such a move would drag the country into a war against the will of much of the population because, as I said, of partition. It would result in a new bout of civil war in Ireland. Instead, Dublin asked for arms with which to defend itself, which Britain would not provide, given the fact that it needed every single weapon that it was producing. Later, conflicts or diplomatic arguments would emerge about the introduction of conscription in Northern Ireland, which Dublin tried to block. Ireland was more than aware of the risks it was running. This was made clear in a message sent by Walsh to Irish diplomats and their wives abroad, that, quote, "It is especially important to avoid expressions of views in any way hostile to the government to which you are accredited, even in the smallest things. In such matters, your diplomatic colleagues are your greatest enemies." Like Salazar, the Irish looked to a great bloc of Catholic nations to emerge in Europe as a counterweight to Nazi Germany. One of these would be France, for whose new regime in Vichy, Walsh and de Valera regularly expressed sympathy. On the 31st of July, Walsh wrote to the Irish ambassador at Vichy, Sean Murphy, quote, "It is felt here that our destiny henceforth will be with that of the continental Catholic nations." This was no guarantee, however, of a pursuit of national goals independent of Germany, because from the start it was made clear by the Vichy government that it would seek inclusion in whatever scheme Germany devised for Europe. So France would align itself to Germany rather than seek to head a kind of a bloc that would oppose Germany. The notion of a great Latin or Catholic community was an illusion, as the Portuguese quickly found out. But unlike the Portuguese, the Irish seemed unwilling or unable to consider the implications of a German victory, which at least some of them believed for a time had been already consummated. You can catch only little snippets of a conversation that must surely have been taking place. Diplomatic efforts, for example, were redirected towards other neutrals, so that the Irish opened embassies in Switzerland and in Portugal. And the above-mentioned Rinne, arguing for an end of Ireland's membership of the League of Nations, wrote in October of 1940, he said, "Taking a long view, we may anticipate that a certain stigma will be regarded as attaching to League membership in the event of a German victory." He was trying to argue against Ireland remaining in the League of Nations, which had very little to do, of course, during the war. But you know, there's the sense that Germany might just win the war and that we don't want to be upsetting them too much. But the practical implications of that German victory, as I've been saying, were never really discussed. In March of 1941, Frank Aiken, the Irish Minister of Defence, met in London with William J. Donovan, who was at the time, in a sense, President Roosevelt's eyes and ears in Europe, and he would obviously go on to found the Office of Strategic Services, the sort of forerunner of the CIA. The conversation that ensued showed that the United States was reasonably sure that a German victory would entail, according to Aiken. In writing it up, Aiken noted, "I asked him, Donovan, how America would be affected should the Germans dominate Europe completely. He said he did not think that they would make a military attack on the United States, but would dominate Africa directly and would utilize their trade system in the South American countries to dominate the world economically. In such eventuality, the Colonel could not see the American system of life surviving." So if the Germans win, it's a really big deal, and we in the United States have to take measures against this. Tellingly, Donovan mentioned, quote, "the Irish trait of not thinking things out to the end," indicating that this is what was now taking place. In a sense, the Irish were concentrating on day-to-day events, not the long-term future. Tellingly as well, the only indication of Irish thought on the nature of the post-war world was Aiken's suggestion that if, quote, "if the democracies were to survive, they would have to put up an alternative which would be better for the people of all countries and their international relationship." In practice, this meant putting an end to the state of affairs in which every nation strove, quote, "to obtain a favorable trade balance." It would be better that a balanced international trade was arrived at through an international clearinghouse and, quote, "by confiscating the balance held by any nation at the end of the accounting period." You can just imagine Donovan thinking that through and thinking, these guys are from another planet, you know, that the United States is going to forgo profiting from its international trade. This is just not going to happen. At this time, Walsh was still convinced of a strong probability of a German victory. The Balkans had now been lost to Germany. And it was possible still, in the spring of 1941, Walsh thought, that the USSR, which enjoyed a pretty close unity of policy and plans with Germany, would capitalize on Britain's weakness, driving southwards into Persia and then presumably India. So he's still entertaining these fantastic visions of the entire world turning on the British Empire. Ireland's war was thus a very lonely one, and it's not surprising that they've given it their own name, the emergency. Overcoming the country's partition was the great national goal of the time, as defined by De Valera and people like Walsh. It prevented Ireland from joining the Allies, and Dublin was left fuming as the great powers of Britain and the United States ignored this design. Dublin, for example, protested strongly when the United States based some of its own military forces in Northern Ireland as part of the build-up for D-Day. You know, they hadn't asked for permission for American forces to be based on Irish soil as far as Dublin was concerned. Urging the ambassador in Washington, D.C. to make the Irish point of view understood by the United States government and United States public opinion, Walsh wrote, "Ireland's long struggle for independence, the prolonged foreign occupation which still exists in the 6 counties, her immediate proximity to the area of hostilities, and her relatively defenseless position all make her situation, in fact, as well in the minds of the people, infinitely more complex than that of America. And you'd have thought the Americans had quite a lot to think about as they entered World War II and were facing Germany and Japan and everything else. Nevertheless, and for all of these protestations, Irish interests were indelibly linked to the survival of Great Britain. And for as long as Britain continued to fight, Dublin did not have to worry about and engage in any sort of speculation about the future, quite unlike, as I suggested, the Portuguese case. In conclusion, we're faced in the cases of Ireland and Portugal with two countries which reacted apparently very differently to the prospect of a German victory in World War II. In Portugal, a territorially satisfied continental nation led by an academic right-wing dictator, the new dispensation provoked a great deal of curiosity and speculation about the contours and the content of the Nazis' new order. This task, which continued for over a year before it was quietly shelved, in the face of the lack of a coherent plan emanating from Berlin, was one which really absorbed Salazar's attention, and as I said, which he enlisted his academic colleagues at the University of Coimbra, asking them for advice and information. In the end, there was no point in continuing. The nature of, the real nature as it emerged of Nazi Germany's relationship with Western Europe was one of naked exploitation. And news began to emerge and to mount about the final solution. So there was everywhere evidence of Nazi crimes and their unwillingness to treat Europe as anything more than a source of labor, money, and supplies for their war. Partly because of the country's geographic position, partly because of its unresolved relationship with Great Britain, the question of partition was paramount in Irish eyes, not the future of Europe. There seems, therefore, as far as I can gather, very little evidence of curiosity about German plans. As I said, you get whispers, you get a sense that somewhere, someone along the line must have been wondering about this. But it's very hard, and one of the reasons that these things are so hard to ascertain is censorship. And both in Portugal, a dictatorship, in Ireland, a democracy, there was very intense press censorship exercised during the war. So there's very little public debate about the nature of the conflict and what the future is going to hold. Nevertheless, what even these initial explorations of the field reveal, especially when one considers the pliant attitude of Spain, of Switzerland, and of Sweden to German demands, and the preferential access to vital strategic raw materials enjoyed by Nazi Germany in its association with the USSR, is that Berlin had, on the back of its defeat of France in 1940, a unique opportunity to refashion Europe in its image, using the remaining neutral countries as a source of international credibility and acceptability. Nevertheless, the extreme ideology of the Nazis trumped any rational sort of statecraft which might have emerged from Nazi Germany. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Questions? We'll run around and capture.
Did Dublin ever think about Irish Americans as any kind of political group that would in any way influence the Roosevelt administration in their favor?
Yeah, I mean, there is a constant attempt to try to mobilize Irish American opinion around neutrality and in the defense of neutrality. But it's kind of a losing battle. As American opinion slowly gears up towards war, and especially once war is declared, then that particular battle is lost. But always an attempt, yes, to try to mobilize this Irish American mass of people here and their newspapers and their organizations in favor of the defense. If nothing else, to get Americans to understand the basis of Irish neutrality and the reasons for it. But it's a very difficult task because, Irish Americans are Americans as well. And once the United States is at war, they just cannot understand why, this English-speaking parliamentary democracy steadfastly refuses to enlist on the side of the common cause as they would see it. So there's a deficit of attention to that Irish argument. Absolutely.
Other questions?
Just looking forward to all the projects I see from Sweden and Switzerland, and it seems that geographically they're in a very different situation than Portugal and Ireland. Portugal and Ireland have certain amount of distance and space from Nazi Germany, whereas Sweden and Switzerland are running towards that. I don't know how far you got into this, but what is your sense of how the Swedish and Swiss situation is different from Portugal and Ireland?
These are two countries, Sweden and Switzerland are, as you say, completely surrounded by Axis powers or occupied by, countries like Norway that have been occupied by the Nazis. I think by and large, they try to keep their head down as much as possible. They have to trade with Germany. So they don't stop doing so. But they cannot afford to take any step which will in any way anger or really displease Germany. They're in a very, very difficult spot. And that's how I think they sort of live almost day by day. Portugal has the problem with Spain and the fear that Franco will go to war and that this will drag the whole Iberian Peninsula, but it's not as bad as having, sharing a border with Germany or a country occupied by Germany. So Portugal can afford to make bases available in 1943 to the British and to later to the Americans, and sort of they come up with this very convoluted answer and they say, well, we're not neutral in the Azores, but we're neutral on the continent. And they can get away with it. At least the German ambassador, really angry. There's no way that Sweden or Switzerland could ever pull anything like that off. They have to be very careful with who they let into their country, who do they give refuge to. They have to be very careful about stating displeasure or concern about any of the actions that Germany is taking. And I think that much more so than the countries like Portugal and Ireland and Spain that have access to the Atlantic, their economies are totally integrated into the German system. Sweden cannot export or cannot import from the rest of the world. You can't physically get materials to Sweden or to Switzerland. So they're very dependent, and that's why I'm actually quite interested. I think their attention to these economic plans must be much more urgent, obviously, than it is in Ireland or even in Portugal, because for them, they are totally dependent now on whatever the Germans decide to do, So, I mean, it's something that I really want to develop and get into, and I think this is the kind of project that will require partnership with other scholars or kind of supporting scholars if I can get the funding. I need somebody who has mastery of the Swedish archives. I need somebody who is very, very good on Switzerland to come and help me on this. So if there's anybody interested.
I know that there were several Irish citizens who, in a sense, turned traitor and joined the British Army and broke neutrality. I was wondering if there was similar stories from Portugal and how that kind of action by Portuguese and Irish citizens affected governmental level of neutrality.
Okay, there's very few, there's very, very few Portuguese that fight in World War II, and some of them are actually pretty much against their will. They're sort of fighting, not necessarily against their will, but it's not what they signed up for, but they end up fighting for the Nazis because there were Portuguese who, say, had joined the Spanish Foreign Legion during the Civil War in Spain, and who are then volunteered as part of the Foreign Legion to make up the division which Franco sends to help the Germans in the war against the Soviet Union. So Spain is never at war with the Soviet Union, but there's quite a large body of Spanish troops fighting, and somewhere within those is the Spanish Foreign Legion, and somewhere within there's a few sort of Portuguese who find themselves, besieging Leningrad, not really knowing how they ended up there. But in terms of going to fight for the Allies, I think it was very difficult to be able to make that move, to actually leave the country. But you're right, you're absolutely right. There's a huge number of Irish people who ignore their government's strategy and its outlook. They sort of give the lie to De Valera's diplomacy, and they go to Britain and they join up and they serve in the army, in the navy, in the air force, and when they come back, they get the cold shoulder. There's no recognition, and I don't think De Valera can politically call them traitors, but that is certainly the feeling, that there is little or no official recognition that they were involved in the right struggle. It's taken a long time, I think, for Ireland to accept them and what they did as something that was of value ultimately to the country. But the official line was that we completely ignore what they chose to do during the war. It's nothing to do with us. If they decided to go and fight for another power, it's their business. But if there'll be no pensions, there'll be no support for them in any sort. They either get that from the British or not at all, as far as Dublin was concerned. But there's no equivalent sort of mass, because I think it was almost a mass enlistment, I think you could say, of Irish people in the British war effort. There's nothing comparable in the case of Portugal.
Perhaps I missed some part of it, but could you say a bit more about dissenting voices, for example, in Ireland, on the other side? And we know, for example, that in the States, up until maybe 1940 or so, there was definitely a cadre of folks in this country who were pro-Nazi, including, for example, the Bush family, who made their wealth on supplying Germany. But what about in Ireland? Were there people who might have, for example, portrayed allegiance or portrayed support for the Nazis as a way of forcing the British out of Ireland?
Yeah, there's two strands of sort of pro-Nazi sentiment. The first, as I mentioned, was from the IRA, which adopts the view of, our enemy's friends are our friends. So they were willing to be in league with the devil if necessary in order to get the Brits out. As far as they were concerned, that was acceptable. But also then conversely, there is such a thing as an Irish far right. The IRA would have been sort of on the left of Irish politics. On the far right, you have the descendants of sort of Ireland's fascist movement, which was led by the former police commander, General Owen O'Duffy, who had a movement called the Blue Shirts, or and the National Corporate Party. There's always a color to these shirts, and that sort of party, O'Duffy went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He tried to raise a military unit to go and fight for General Franco, and then that didn't work out too well. They weren't particularly good at it, and Franco sent them home. But they come back and try to make a triumph out of it, and the sort of the remnants of that go on to form I think it's called the National Corporatist Party, and they become the Green Shirts at that stage. And they're looking forward to a German victory, and they're planning for it, and they're sort of they're looking forward to being the Irish Quislings, if you will, that when the Germans come and sort this country out, then, we will declare our allegiance. But you're talking about minuscule groups of dozens of people whom the Irish government is able to keep a very close eye on. So sort of military intelligence is able to exercise a great surveillance over these groups. And because it was a really repressive country during the war, and the expression of opinion was very difficult. And like I say, censorship of the press was very severe in Ireland during the war. So they really had no platform through which to make their views known. So they're sort of in their apartments and bedsits hoping for the Nazis to arrive one day, but they can't really get the message out. And they, like I say, they are infiltrated by the sort of, the Irish police and military intelligence that keeps an eye on them.
The discussion was about neutrality vis-a-vis Britain and the neutrality vis-a-vis.
Yes, I mean, they're I think, whereas the Irish government's neutrality was ultimately closer to the Allies. And they do perform a number of functions, like say, for example, if Allied aircrew crash on Irish soil, the crew was sent to the border with Northern Ireland and sort of returned to the Allies, whereas German airmen or sailors who were picked up were interned for the duration of the war and never returned to Germany. There are a number of practical steps, very sort of low-key, that as the war goes on, the Irish perform to benefit the Allies. But these people that I mentioned, in answer to your question, their neutrality is in the other direction. They're hoping that somehow Germany will, in fact, win. And somebody like Walsh, well, these reports that he writes, these memorandum, in the end, I think maybe De Valera reins him in some way, and he stops writing these things. But like I said, there's almost a kind of a wish fulfillment here that finally, God, they're getting what they deserve. The whole of the world is turning against the British. But deep down, I think he understands that that's not actually going to benefit Ireland that much. That Ireland is so integrated economically and culturally with Great Britain that they'd be entering into a great unknown if Britain was to succumb to the Nazis.
So, do you think that the Irish were just so hell-bent on having a united Catholic Europe that they were willing to overlook the obvious problems that Germany was bringing to, during the war? So, basically, do you think that since they were so willing, they wanted so badly to have a united Catholic Europe that they were just kind of looking at Great Britain like, okay, you've kind of done us poorly before, you'll do us poorly again, so that's why they stay neutral?
Yeah, I think what they're looking for, it's not so much a united Catholic Europe. What they're thinking is that, if Germany does win, then there needs to emerge a bloc of nations that, working in concert, will make the Germans see sense. And they see that in kind of an alliance of sorts that would emerge with Italy, with France, with Spain and Portugal and Ireland. And they think that somehow, I mean, it's pure fantasy that such a bloc could get off the ground and that it could mount, in the face of a victorious Germany, any kind of opposition. I think they imagined that sort of Britain would withdraw into kind of a defeated Britain would withdraw into sort of a shell, and then on the continent there would be some kind of possible relationship between such a Catholic bloc of nations. And it's a dream that they hold on to even after the war now, into 1940, at the end of 1945, 1946, they're still thinking that such a bloc might emerge. And they're thinking now already in terms of a bloc that will be able to stand up against communism. And that there will be a Catholic bloc of nations that will preserve Western Christian civilization in Europe, and they don't think that anybody can resist that apart from these very, very Catholic nations. So it's sort of very pie in the sky stuff. I mean, it bears very little, or it has very little grounding in reality. But it was a way of envisaging a Europe that would be more favorable to Irish interests, I think.
Question? Yeah, Connor.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit on, you spoke a little bit on the idea of emergency and how modern Irish people use that to really remember World War II and that era of history. Could you speak a little bit on the same idea for Portugal, how the Portuguese people today remember World War II and how that's reflected in their history?
Right. It's interesting. I think the attitude to World War II is very politicized in Portugal, and it's dominated by the reaction to Salazar. Okay, so I think there is a more pragmatic, possibly politically neutral, sometimes more conservative set of scholars who I think are willing to give Salazar the benefit of the doubt. And I would include myself among those, and I took a lot of flack for it, but I think that on the whole, when he added up all of the options, and he was by no means happy with the Allies. He detested the Soviet Union, and he was really skeptical about the United States, and he thought that, you know, Wilson had been a calamity, and that sort of post-Second World War American domination of Europe would also be a calamity, you know. But on the whole, I think that he understood that the nature of Nazi Germany was such that it would be an absolute disaster for Portugal should Germany win. As opposed to that, there are then a number of scholars who just sort of defined Salazar as a fascist, which I can understand the reasoning, I don't quite agree, who essentially highlight his links with the fascist powers of Italy and Germany, and who stress that that is whom he sided with naturally. Okay, so in terms of certainly scholarly opinion, there's a great debate. There's no consensus. Some say that Salazar collaborated with the Nazis. Others say that it was actually a lot more nuanced than that, and that when he could, he sided with the Allies, or he favored Allied interests, and that it takes a long time for the British to ask for a concrete favor. It takes them until, really late summer and the fall of 1943 to ask for access to bases. But the moment that they ask, Salazar says yes. And you're left wondering, well, why did you wait so long? You know, could you have done it in 1942? You know, how many Allied sailors' lives would have been saved had you made that request earlier? And then in popular terms, I think immediately after the war, there's an enormous sense of relief that Portugal hadn't gone to war. And what Salazar does, and that was something that wasn't in his hands to determine, you know, it's just the way the war went, the Iberian Peninsula was never involved. It's just the luck of the draw. We were lucky, others weren't, and that's just how things happened. But there's what the regime certainly does is it attributes the preservation of peace to Salazar's great, you know, statesmanship. He was the man who kept us away from the war. And so that's a kind of a string that is added to his bow, that of the supreme visionary statesman who preserved us from the war. Much in the same way that Franco does. I mean, Franco had been chomping at the bit to get into the war, and then that doesn't work out. And then he also takes credit for keeping Spain out of the war. And again, that had nothing really to do with his decisions. The war could very well have come to Spain, and he wouldn't have been able to prevent it. So there is that sense that people's opinion and sentiment was manipulated rather shamelessly by the regime. It's the same thing with the question of refugees. There's a great deal of manipulation. Salazar was dead set against allowing refugees into the country because they would come with foreign customs and practices and ideologies that were contrary to Portuguese nationalism. But they come in anyway. You know, you can't stop these great movements of people. And then they retrospectively took credit for being a country of welcome and refuge and clothing and housing and feeding people and saving their lives. So, you know, there is a great deal of hypocrisy attached. But
Can Please join me in thanking once again.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.